At 6 p.m. on August 5, 2023, Rachel Morin left for what should have been a routine evening walk. Her car would still be sitting at the trailhead hours later. Rachel would never return to it. She had parked near the William Street entrance to the Ma and Pa Heritage Trail in Bel Air, Maryland, a quiet, wooded path she knew well, the place she went to clear her head after long days spent running her own house-cleaning business and raising 5 children largely on her own. She'd walked this trail before. She would have had no reason to think this evening was different from any other. By the time her boyfriend realized she hadn't come home and called for help, night had already fallen over Harford County. Her phone wasn't answering. Her car hadn't moved. It would sit there, empty, in the dark, for hours, the only visible trace of a woman who had simply gone for a walk and never come back. Within 24 hours, a search team would find something in the woods off that trail that turned a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. But identifying the man responsible would take investigators nearly a year, and force them to rely on a forensic technique that had become one of the most powerful tools available to modern law enforcement. This is the story of what happened to Rachel Morin, reconstructed entirely from police statements, charging documents, courtroom testimony, and 2 years of reporting on one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent American history. Before any of what follows, before the DNA, the manhunt, the trial, Rachel Morin was simply a mother of 5: Faye, Violet, Octavia, Declan, and Lila. She raised them largely on her own while running her own house-cleaning business, the kind of work that demands early mornings and long days, client after client, with little room for a day off. Family remembered her as deeply religious, resilient, and vibrant, with a genuine love of country music and a serious, personal commitment to fitness. She wore her tattoos as a form of self-expression, and those close to her described someone who put real effort into staying strong and active, not for appearance but because movement itself seemed to give her energy. That commitment wasn't incidental. According to Harford County's top prosecutor, the trail represented something close to peace itself for Rachel, the one place she could step away from the demands of 5 kids and a business, if only for 30 minutes, and just move through the trees in silence. She was the youngest of Patty Morin's children, and by every account remained close to her siblings well into adulthood, the kind of sibling relationship that doesn't fade once everyone has their own household and their own children to raise. Friends who joined the community in mourning her later described a woman full of joy and energy, someone whose presence changed a room simply by being in it. Her brother Michael would later stand in a courtroom and reject any version of her death that reduced her to a statistic. She was not, he said, some kind of cosmic accident, she was a life that had meaning on its own terms. Her half-sister called her a radiant light in a dark world. Hold on to that. Because for most of the next year, this case would be defined by silence, forensic labs, and DNA reports, and it's easy, in that kind of story, to lose sight of the fact that 5 children were waiting at home for a mother who would never come back to explain what happened. On the evening of August 5, 2023, Rachel went looking for 30 quiet minutes on a trail she loved. She would not get them back. Months later, investigators would learn something deeply unsettling about the man responsible. He wasn't from Maryland. He wasn't from anywhere near Bel Air. Police would come to believe he had already committed another violent crime nearly 3,000 miles away, and at the moment Rachel stepped onto that trail, nobody watching her walk away that evening had any idea he existed at all. Here is everything confirmed about that evening. Rachel was last seen alive around 6 p.m., driving herself to the William Street entrance of the Ma and Pa Trail for what appears to have been her ordinary routine. She parked. She walked in. She did not walk out. Her boyfriend, Richard Tobin, reported her missing when she failed to return home that night. That's where the confirmed timeline simply stops. Investigators have never publicly released a minute-by-minute account of what happened to Rachel once she stepped onto that trail. What they would eventually determine, based only on physical evidence at the scene, was that she was attacked somewhere along the path and her body moved into the woods nearby. For one full night, her car sat alone at the trailhead, and nobody knew if Rachel was lost, hurt, or worse. By the next afternoon, they would have their answer. It would be far worse than anyone had let themselves imagine. The search began almost immediately. By Sunday, August 6th, less than a day after Rachel vanished, Harford County searchers were moving through the woods around the trail, calling her name, checking the underbrush along a path that most of them had probably walked recreationally 100 times before. They didn't have to search long. That afternoon, a searcher found a woman's body off the trail, near a drainage tunnel. It was Rachel. Her death was classified a homicide within hours. Investigators would say almost nothing publicly about the crime scene itself, a discipline that would define this case for the next year, except that Rachel had died in a violent attack, and that they believed she'd been assaulted on the trail and then moved. Near where the body was found, evidence markers began going up along the tree line. Investigators recovered a garden shovel close to a spot where a cell phone had been detected pinging repeatedly. It wasn't much. Investigators have never publicly said how significant that shovel ultimately proved to be to the case, but at the time, it was one of the first physical clues they had to work with. The sheriff's office appealed publicly for anyone who had been near the trail's Williams Street entrance or the nearby Ellendale Street lot between 5 and 11 p.m. the night before. A reward went up, $10,000 at first, then doubled to $20,000 by September, and eventually raised to $35,000 as the case dragged on without an arrest. Rachel's mother, Rachel Morin, posted an open letter to the community days later, thanking strangers around the world for grieving alongside her family. Sheriff Jeffrey Garler urged residents to stay cautious on local trails, because whoever had done this was still out there, unnamed and unaccounted for. Investigators had a crime scene, a discarded shovel recovered nearby, cell phone activity they were trying to understand, and one crucial piece of evidence that had just begun its journey through a forensic laboratory. What they didn't have, for many, many months, was a name. It would take nearly a year of forensic work for the evidence they already had to finally produce one. The community didn't wait for that name to grieve. On August 19, 2023, 2 weeks after Rachel's death, more than 200 people gathered at the Williams Street trailhead for a vigil, walking the same path Rachel had taken that evening, some carrying flowers and rosaries they later wove into the chain-link fencing along the trail. Rachel Morin stood on the bridge near where her daughter's body had been found and told the crowd that as a mother, all you want is to be there for your children, to protect them. It was a sentiment that would define her public presence for the next 2 years. 12 days after Rachel's death, investigators got a hit, and, at first, it looked like exactly the kind of thing that cracks a case open fast. DNA recovered from the crime scene had been run through CODIS, the national database of criminal DNA profiles. There was no name attached to it. But there was something else, a match to DNA from a completely different, unsolved crime, nearly 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles. 5 months earlier, in March 2023, a man had broken into a Los Angeles home and violently attacked a woman and her 9-year-old daughter. Security camera footage had captured him leaving the house in darkness, half-dressed, carrying his own clothes. He'd left a hat behind. That hat carried his DNA, and it matched the DNA from Rachel's crime scene. The same man had committed a violent home invasion in California, then a murder in Maryland, 5 months apart. Investigators finally had a physical description: Hispanic, in his 20s, around 5'9", roughly 160 pounds. At a news conference, Harford County Colonel William Davis told reporters that investigators believed Rachel likely hadn't known her attacker, that this appeared to be, in his words, a random act of violence, and that beyond his presence in Los Angeles that March, detectives knew almost nothing else about the man they were now hunting. The sheriff's office released that footage and composite sketches publicly, hoping someone would recognize the man captured on camera. Nobody did. For months, the case seemed to stall in public view. In April 2024, 8 months after Rachel's death, her family went on national television to plead for information, with the family's attorney publicly floating a theory that would later prove closer to the truth than anyone realized, that the suspect, having already shown he could travel across the country undetected, might have left the United States entirely. But behind the scenes, investigators weren't standing still. They'd handed the case to a new kind of forensic science, one that had solved cold cases nobody thought could be solved. It would take 9 more months for that process to turn the DNA they already had into an actual name. And when it finally did, investigators would realize they weren't hunting a local killer at all, but a man who had already crossed a national border once, and might be preparing to disappear across another. In September 2023, the Harford County Sheriff's Office and the FBI submitted the crime scene DNA to Othram, a private lab in Texas that builds far more detailed genetic profiles than a standard CODIS search allows, profiles precise enough to compare against public genealogy databases, the kind ordinary people use to trace their own family histories. This technique is called investigative genetic genealogy. It doesn't find a suspect directly. It finds his relatives first, sometimes distant ones, 4th or 5th cousins with no idea they share DNA with a killer, and from there, genealogists build outward, branch by branch, public record by public record, until a name emerges. It is slow, methodical work, closer to archival research than a lab test with an instant readout, tracing one family branch after another until something holds. There's no guarantee it produces a name at all, many profiles submitted for analysis never do. For Rachel's case, it worked, but on its own timeline, no amount of public pressure could speed up. Once Othram finished sequencing the profile, it went to the FBI's Baltimore genetic genealogy team, and the waiting began again, this time, for a family tree to finish taking shape. By early May 2024, 9 months after Rachel's murder, the family tree work had a name attached to it, Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez, 23, an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador. A name from a genealogy chart isn't proof. It's a lead. To turn it into evidence, investigators needed his actual DNA, collected and compared directly against the crime scene profile, and getting it meant, for the first time in this case, getting close to people who actually knew him. According to the sheriff's office, Martinez Hernandez's own family members handed over several items of his clothing, including, notably, 5 socks that carried DNA consistent with the profile from Rachel's crime scene. When the lab compared the DNA on those items to the profile recovered from Rachel's body, investigators finally saw what they'd spent 9 months waiting for. The profiles matched. For the first time since Rachel Morin disappeared, investigators weren't chasing an unknown man anymore. They had a name. What investigators pieced together next reached far beyond Harford County. Martinez Hernandez, they learned, was wanted in El Salvador in connection with a killing there. He'd fled the country, crossed into the United States illegally in early 2023, turned back by Border Patrol 3 times before finally succeeding on a 4th attempt, and surfaced months later in Los Angeles, where he was linked to the assault on the mother and 9-year-old girl. From there, he'd made his way to Maryland. And after killing Rachel, he hadn't disappeared the way investigators feared he might. Family members told detectives he'd spent December 2023 through May 2024 quietly staying with relatives in Maryland, living, undetected, in the same state, for months after the murder investigators were still working to solve. The arrest finally came on a Friday night in June 2024, nearly 10 months after Rachel's death, 1,300 miles away, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Sheriff Garland didn't hide his suspicion that Rachel hadn't been this man's only victim. The Los Angeles case had already confirmed it. Martinez Hernandez waived extradition. Law enforcement escorted him off a plane at Martin State Airport on June 20, 2024, and he was formally indicted on July 2, denied bail. Almost a year after Rachel walked into the woods near her home, the man accused of killing her was finally sitting in a Maryland jail cell, waiting for a trial that would test everything investigators believed they had proven. The evidence that would ultimately decide this case had been on Rachel's body the entire time. A forensic expert testified in court that DNA matching Martinez Hernandez was recovered from her neck, her left wrist, her chest, and her Apple Watch. The odds that it belonged to anyone else, the expert testified, were something close to 1 in several hundred octillion, a figure so large it's difficult to translate into anything meaningful, except to say that in the language of forensic science, it functions as close to certainty as DNA evidence gets. A separate calculation offered during testimony placed the odds even higher, at roughly 1 in 400 nonillion. For other men connected to the case, including Rachel's boyfriend Richard Tobin, were tested. None of them matched. One by one, over the course of the trial, prosecutors presented evidence excluding alternative suspects who had been investigated, narrowing the case down to the one name investigators had spent 9 months tracing through a family tree. Prosecutors also tied Martinez Hernandez directly to the Los Angeles hat, the same piece of physical evidence that had cracked the case open in the first place, establishing that the man who attacked a mother and child in California in March 2023 was the same man who killed Rachel 5 months later. Jurors also watched his interrogation video, projected in a courtroom otherwise silent except for his recorded voice. In it, Martinez Hernandez offered an explanation for how his DNA ended up at the scene, that someone had deliberately framed him, cutting a piece of his hair and collecting his sweat to plant at the crime scene. The defense's response to 9 days of prosecution testimony, 32 witnesses in total, was a single witness and roughly 10 minutes of presentation. The jury would not need much longer than that to reach its own conclusion. The trial opened April 1, 2025, in Harford County Circuit Court under Judge Yolanda L. Cuttin. A defense request to move the trial elsewhere, citing the case's national attention, was denied. Martinez Hernandez had already turned down a plea deal months earlier. He wanted a trial. He got one. 9 days of testimony, delivered to a courtroom packed daily with reporters and, every single day, Rachel's family. Then, on April 14, 2025, the jury filed out to deliberate, and returned in under an hour. Guilty. First-degree premeditated murder. First-degree rape. Third-degree sexual offense. Kidnapping. All counts. Reporters in the courtroom described him showing no visible reaction as the verdict was read. He was handcuffed and led out. Outside the courthouse, Sheriff Gala told cameras the man who'd taken Rachel's life so horrifically would never harm anyone again. Inside, State's Attorney Allison Healy and Patty Morin embraced. Sentencing didn't come for another 4 months. On August 11, 2025, Rachel's family returned to that courtroom one final time. Over 4 hours, Patty Morin, dressed in black, seated in front of a courtroom microphone, described living every day since her daughter's death with a grief she compared to a marathon that never ends. Michael Morin told the court he forgave Martinez Hernandez, framing it in explicitly religious terms, even as he insisted his sister's death shouldn't go unanswered. Her half-sister called her a radiant light one more time. Her brother John spoke of a bond with Rachel that would now never be whole again. The defense used part of that same hearing to argue for something less than the maximum sentence. Assistant Public Defender Tara Lecomte described Martinez Hernandez's upbringing in El Salvador, a childhood that ended formally in the classroom before 8th grade, replaced by work on a coffee farm and selling bread to help support his family, and later a job at a window fabrication plant before the pandemic's economic disruption pushed him toward the United States. Lecomte told the court her client respected the jury's verdict but continued to maintain his innocence, and she asked Judge Cuttin to consider a sentence that would leave open, at least in theory, the possibility of parole. Judge Cuttin didn't hesitate. She called the trail a place of real beauty that this crime had turned into something that terrorized an entire community. Looking directly at Martinez Hernandez, she told him he'd taken a life that was never his to take, and that she saw no hope of rehabilitating him. Then she handed down the maximum sentence the law allowed, life without parole, plus a consecutive life sentence, plus 40 more years. Martinez Hernandez said he intended to appeal. As of mid-2026, that appeal is still pending, unresolved, but so far, nothing has disturbed the verdict or the sentence. The criminal case is over. What it leaves behind is not. Rachel's murder became something larger than a Harford County homicide, a case repeatedly cited in national political debates over immigration, referenced by federal officials up to the sitting president and the Secretary of Homeland Security. Sheriff Gala used the case publicly, more than once, to argue that gaps in the immigration system had allowed a man already wanted for one killing to enter the country and take 2 more lives before he was caught. That's the version of this story that made national headlines. It is not, ultimately, the one that matters most to 5 children who no longer have their mother. In the years since, reporting has revealed a harder, quieter aftermath, civil disputes over donations and trust money raised in Rachel's memory, with allegations that funds meant for her 5 children haven't fully reached them. It's an uncomfortable footnote to a story that drew worldwide sympathy, a reminder that public grief doesn't always translate into support for the people actually living with the loss. The trail itself hasn't gone back to being ordinary. In the days after her death, Rachel's family hung her photo on a tree near where she was found, alongside flowers and rosaries left by strangers. A year later, on August 4, 2024, the family returned for a formal remembrance walk, lining the path with photographs tracing Rachel's life from childhood to adulthood, Patty Morin stopping at each one to share a memory with the crowd that had gathered around her. She told those who came that the only reason her family had made it through the year was the community standing behind them. Harford County Executive Bob Casilli, who attended, later said the county was working with the family on a permanent sculpture or memorial for the trail. The family has also discussed plans for an annual celebration of life event in Rachel's honor. Not every conversation to come out of Rachel's case has been resolved so cleanly. County officials spent much of the following year debating how to actually make the trail safer, including a proposed $1 million investment in surveillance cameras along its length, with the county executive and the sheriff's office publicly disagreeing over funding and implementation. It's a smaller, more bureaucratic kind of aftermath than a courtroom verdict, but it's part of the same unresolved question every trail user in Bel Air has had to sit with since August 2023. What does it take to make a place like this feel safe again? A place that used to mean nothing beyond a nice walk now carries a different weight for everyone in Harford County who knows its name. And the method that finally solved this case, DNA sequencing so precise it can trace a killer through the family trees of strangers who never met him, has quietly become one of the most significant tools in American law enforcement, because of exactly this kind of case, a man who left almost nothing behind, in 2 states, 5 months apart, until his own genetic code betrayed him. Rachel's car didn't move that evening. It stayed exactly where she'd parked it, at the Williams Street trailhead, waiting through the dark for someone who would never come back to drive it home. For nearly a year, investigators worked to explain why. A DNA lab in Texas. An FBI genealogy team in Baltimore. The unknowing help of distant relatives who had submitted their own DNA for reasons that had nothing to do with a murder in Maryland. A family that refused to let her case fade from public view. All of it, slowly, converging on one name. They eventually found their answer. Rachel's 5 children know now what happened to their mother, and they know the man responsible is serving a sentence that will keep him from ever hurting anyone else. But there's a question underneath that answer that no verdict can resolve. Her family will spend the rest of their lives wondering what might have happened if that walk had simply stayed what it was supposed to be, one ordinary evening, on a trail Rachel loved, ending the way it always had before, with her getting back in that car and driving home. Rachel Morin went looking for 30 quiet minutes of peace. What she found instead became the case that proved a killer can hide from witnesses, from cameras, even from an entire country, but not from his own DNA. Every evening, people still walk the Ma and Pa Heritage Trail. Most finish their walk and head home. Rachel Morin never did. For everyone else, August 5, 2023, became another day on the calendar. For her family, it never ended.